Good morning and welcome to the 27th meeting of the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee in 2019. Can I ask everyone in the public gallery to please turn off or turn to silent your phones? Item number 1 is decision on taking business in private. Do members agree to take items 3 and 4 in private this morning?
Agreed.
Thank you. Item 2 is the Section 22 report on the 2018-19 audit of the Scottish Prison Service. I'd like to welcome our witnesses to the meeting this morning. Colin McConnell, Chief Executive, Kate Hudson, Interim Director of Strategy and Stakeholder Engagement, Melanie Allen, Head of Finance, all from the Scottish Prison Service, and Paul Johnson, Director General, Education, Communities and Justice, Neil Rennick, Director of Justice, and Donna McKinnon, Deputy Director and Head of Community Justice Division, all from the Scottish Government. We've got 2 opening statements this morning, the first from Colin McConnell.
Convener and committee members, I and my SPS colleagues are grateful to have this opportunity to meet with you in the company of senior officials from the Scottish Government with whom we work closely on all matters relating to the prison service to discuss the significant concerns of the Auditor-General for Scotland, Caroline Gardner, with regards to both the immediate and longer-term sustainability of the Scottish Prison Service. By way of a previous evidence session, both the Auditor-General and SPS's independent auditor, Scotland Creef, have directed your attention to the following facts about the current operating realities of the Scottish Prison Service. Since 2014-15, the revenue budget is reduced by 12.5% in real terms and potentially a further 1.7% in real terms this year. And whilst the delivery demand of the SPS over the same period has fluctuated, more recently demand has grown at an extraordinary pace and complexity, with the prison population this year reaching historically high levels. Staff costs represent over 50% of SPS's revenue budget, and overall, around 85% of SPS's revenue budget is subject to ongoing, mainly contractual commitments, meaning that the proportion of committed spend is growing year on year. And private prison contracts, which are inflated by RPIX plus 1.5% each year, are consuming an ever-increasing proportion of SPS's revenue resource, which on the basis of a flat cash settlement results in additional savings requirements from the public sector. So with those hard, perhaps uncomfortable facts as a backdrop, I believe it's right, necessary and timely that this committee develops a good understanding of the serious day-to-day operational pressures confronting the SPS management team and our frontline staff, the nature and causes of those pressures and whether they are likely to pass quickly or remain, and as a result of that inquiry, help to determine what changes and improvements may be needed to be implemented if we collectively are to succeed to address the Auditor-General's fundamental concern, which is the need for a predictable, firm and sustainable operating basis for the SPS going forward, that is informed not only by the operational realities of today, but also the anticipated demands and performance expectations of tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr McConnell. Paul Johnson, I understand you have an opening statement as well.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity to provide evidence today, and I agree with what my colleague Colin McConnell has said about the importance of the issues that we are examining and welcome the committee's consideration of these issues. Scottish Government's priorities for justice in Scotland include using prison only where necessary to address offending or to protect public safety, focusing on recovery and reintegration. Scotland's prisons face a number of significant challenges that have been set out very clearly by Audit Scotland in their Section 22 report. Many of these are a consequence of the rapid increase in the prison population which began in 2018. This increase was not readily predictable and came after a number of years in which the population fell. Compared with a decade ago, far fewer people now receive custodial sentences each year, including fewer short-term sentences and fewer people convicted of crime requiring a life sentence. However, those who do go on to custody will, on average, receive longer sentences and spend longer in custody before being approved for release. The profile of those in custody is also changing, with increasing numbers of sex offenders, people with serious and organised crime backgrounds, and people requiring support with mental health, substance misuse, and physical and social care. Our prisons also face security challenges in identifying ever-changing psychoactive drugs. The Cabinet Secretary for Justice has acknowledged these challenges and has committed to taking the action necessary to address them. Part of the solution involves building on the strengths that our prisons have. And so I would highlight that both the current and previous chief inspectors of prisons have noted that in general our prisons are well ordered and well run, and they have commended the dedication and commitment of frontline prison staff working with those in their care. Responding to the challenges in our prisons requires additional investment. During the current year, Scottish ministers have made available additional funding to ensure that SPS can respond to immediate budget pressures. Ministers have also agreed a multi-year pay deal for staff. They have also committed to making further substantial investment in modernising the prison's estate, including the new female estate and a replacement for HMP Berlini. The solutions to the challenges highlighted by the Auditor-General require collaborative leadership and sustained long-term commitment across the justice system, within the Parliament and among wider public services. We outlined in our letter to the committee the range of actions that we are taking to deliver that change, with a particular focus on strengthening community justice services. And we're happy to respond to any questions that the committee has today.
Thank you very much, Mr Johnson. I'm going to start with an opening question in response to both of your statements, because we know that the Auditor-General published her Section 22 report, which to all intents and purposes is an emergency report to say that there are problems in the system. And the committee, as we've taken our evidence, has been really concerned as we dig into some of the issues facing the prison service about the lack of planning that has gone on over perhaps the last 10 years for the prison service. Now, Mr Johnson, you just talked about the spike in prisoner numbers in 2018, but we've heard some evidence that some of that may have been predictable, but some of the other pressures on the prison service have been long-term and very much predictable and even in your own hands, such as there's been an underspend of the capital budget over the last 10 years. The committee is very interested to know why that capital budget has been underspent and why it keeps being handed back to government when we don't have the new women's facilities built yet, and when Berlini is 50% over capacity and one of perhaps the oldest jails in Europe. We've also got the situation that staff sickness has been increasing over the past 3 years, but the Prison Officers Association warned you about this and the pressures on prison staff way back in 2013. So, can I ask both of you, in response to your opening statements, what have you been doing to anticipate this and plan for it?
I'm happy to answer that first and then hand over to Colin McConnell. I think, as you have done, it's quite important to separate out different aspects of the issues that we have facing us this morning. In terms of prison numbers, I think it's important to recognise that over a significant number of years, prisoner numbers were falling. And what we saw from March 2018 was a massive single-year increase in those numbers. What I can assure the committee is that very detailed work happens on a day-to-day basis that involves colleagues in both Scottish Government and the Scottish Prison Service and other justice partners to model and anticipate the prison numbers. I think the Auditor-General's Exhibit 4 in her report quite helpfully shows what's been going on with prison numbers and also demonstrates some of the uncertainty that exists around the future direction of prison numbers. What I can say is that we have detailed modelling, we do undertake very detailed work on that, and I know my colleague Neil could speak in much more detail about the nature of the modelling. The other issues, I recognise some of them are ones that we have been aware of and have been working on for a significant number of years, and they those issues such as sickness absence on the part of staff, the health needs of those in custody are ones which I know my colleague Colin could speak to in detail.
Okay, I'll ask Mr McConnell to address that in a minute. Just let me drill down into the 2018 spike. What was it due to?
So again, I would turn to Exhibit 5 in the Auditor General's report, which I think gives a very, very clear articulation of the complex nature of the issues that we're looking at today. So the spike was not down to only one thing. It was down to a whole range of factors, and really the seven factors that are set out in Exhibit 5, I think really give a very clear articulation of it. So we could point to and discuss in some detail the legislative changes which have contributed to the increase in numbers, such as the ending of automatic early release. We could point to other factors such as the increase in numbers of prisoners on remand, also the reducing use of home detention curfew, and also the fact that fewer people in prison are getting out at the time that they used to get out. We could also point to the increased sentence length, a whole range of factors.
That's my point, Mr Johnson, because forgive me, but I think you said in your first response to my question was that the 2018 spike was unpredicted. But these Exhibit 5 shows the number of factors that were predictable, because the ending of automatic early release was legislation that was approved in 2015. And these legislative measures, you must have known they were coming down the line. I mean, it's your department that deals with them. So how can you then say that the spike in prisoners in 2018 was unpredictable?
So what could not be predicted was the way in which the numbers were going to rise as quickly as they did. So there were factors which absolutely could be predicted, such as the impact of ending automatic early release, and we have detailed modelling that sets out the impact of that. But we have other factors in the mix, such as the reductions in certain types of crime that had been keeping prison population down, other factors such as the average sentence length, which we cannot predict with accuracy, but which is sharply increasing. So what we have is a complex mix of factors that have led to this increase, which on the basis of all of our analysis was very much at the upper end of what was being expected. Now, my colleague Neil Rennick could say a little bit more about that if the committee would find that helpful.
Yes, in a minute. So you do admit that some of the factors that led to the spike were predictable?
Some of the factors could be predicted, yes.
Yeah, I think as Paul says, we did recognise those factors, and we recognise the ones that are reflected in the Auditor General's report. Some of them were not new issues, so the growth in cases involving domestic abuse being identified and feeding through into the justice system, the growth in sexual offending, were issues that have been growing over the last decade, as you say, and were actually reflected during the years in which the prison population was falling. So it's not simply just a matter of the number of cases increasing, resulting in an increase in the population, because to a large extent that growth was already built into the numbers when the population levels were falling. In terms of automatic early release, we again, as you say, we had predicted what the scale of that. We know very well what the potential scale of that is, because we know how many prisoners are feeding through. The projection for 2018 was that even if all of those prisoners who might have been eligible for automatic early release were then not approved for release by the parole board, the maximum impact that could have had on the prison population was 40 places. So it was not expected that that would have an enormous impact in 2018-19. The other area that was unpredictable was home detention curfew, which was an issue that only emerged during the year 2018-19. It wasn't something we were able to see in advance, the sort of change that happened with that. So as I say, we were aware of all those issues. As we go on, I can talk further about some of the actions that we were taking to try and mitigate that, and what we were doing with through the Justice Board and with other agencies to respond to that. But it wasn't a case that we didn't recognise those pressures. They were reflected in the Justice Vision and Priorities document published in 2017, and they've been reflected in the work that we've been taking forward over the past few years.
It worries me, from the government answers that the word unpredictable keeps coming up, because we've got prisoners, 8,700 now, in our prison system. We know what they were convicted for. We know how long their sentences are. We know the legislation that's coming down the line and when it's going to be implemented. So surely it's a matter of collecting that data and having good data analysis. Why are there so many factors that are unpredictable here?
It's a really helpful point to try and clarify for the committee. I should say the word unpredictable isn't our word. It was the word used by Audit Scotland in their overview of the criminal justice system published in 2011. And it's really helpful to read what they said. The criminal justice system is demand-led, but understanding that demand is not straightforward and the demand can be unpredictable, that the nature of the criminal justice system is not as simple as seeing the number of cases feeding through and what that might feed through into the business in the courts and business in the prisons. If that was the case, then we would be expecting, and indeed that's part of the work we've been doing over the last few years, you would be expecting the prison population to be falling because crime has fallen significantly over the last decade. The number of cases feeding into our courts have been falling over the last decade, reflecting the changes in the nature of crime. There is a much more complex set of actions that are going on than purely the number of cases feeding through. It relates to the changing nature of offending. It relates to the changes in terms of sentencing, but also importantly, it relates to changes in the way in which people are feeding through our prisons and how likely or not they are to be released. And there's a whole range of different factors there that are impacting on that are genuinely very, very difficult to model and predict. And this is a bit of work that our Justice Systems Planning Group that specifically looks at these issues have been doing. And there is a reason why that funnel grows very quickly after a short period in trying to predict prisoner numbers, because there are a range of complex factors that drive the prison population that aren't purely about the number of cases.
I do take that point, Mr Rennick, but I would say, the Audit Scotland report says that 400 additional prisoner places over the last decade were taken by convictions for domestic abuse. But we all knew that legislation and that focus on domestic abuse was coming down the line. Kenny McCaskill had been talking about that in this Parliament for years. So things like that were predictable.
Predictable, and I'm incredibly proud of the work that staff within my directorate have done with reference to domestic abuse, including the new domestic abuse offence, but also the aggravator that was introduced before that, and the other work that's been delivered on that, along with the Crown and Police. So we did know those figures. A large part of that increase ahead of the new offence actually grew after 2014-15. So there was a rapid rise then. We'd actually seen that levelling off as we moved towards 2018-19. So actually, both in terms of domestic abuse and sexual offending, the main increases in those actually happened before we came into this year, and those weren't in 17-18. Numbers of convictions, both for domestic abuse and sexual offending, had levelled off. Okay,
thank you very much. I was going to come back to Mr McConnell's point on sickness, but one of my colleagues is going to pick that up in a later question. I've got a supplementary from Liam Kerr on this point, and then I'm moving to Anas Sarwar.
Yeah, just very briefly, so you said you couldn't predict what was going to happen in terms of numbers, but you must have planned for a kind of worst-case scenario, and indeed, if the numbers were greater in previous years, there must have been a scenario envisaged where it could go back to that. And if that's right, looking forward, what happens if the total capacity is exceeded, perhaps in the near future, and what contingency plans have either the Scottish Government or the SPS got to deal with that eventuality?
I can confirm that working on contingency plans and keeping the numbers under constant review is something that is done with both SPS and Scottish Government, and it may be something that my colleague Colin would like to speak more about. We've received and regularly receive updates and briefing on a range of scenarios and risks to ensure that we are ready to deal with those that are considered most likely.
Thanks very much, Mr Kerr. Again, these are really, really useful issues to discuss, because as I think it's generally recognised the SPS is in a difficult place. We've got too many people in our care for the facilities we have. But as has been commented by both the Chief Inspector and our own auditors, for all of that, SPS is performing comparatively well. So I think we should recognise the considerable efforts that men and women at the front line are putting in and the results they're achieving. But to go back to the challenge that Mr. Kerr has set out, I may answer that in two parts, if I may, and it's to address primarily this concept that somehow we are dealing with a spike. I don't think we are dealing with a spike, and I think if we look at the reasons why the prison population has gone up in the way that it has, and as Neil and Paula set out the constituent parts of that, it's unlikely that we're going to see any sort of remedying of those pressures anytime soon. So the approach that I and we are taking in the prison service is in recognition that those pressures are likely to remain for many months, if not longer. So with that in mind, contingency planning is absolutely crucial. This morning we unlocked 8,290 people in a system that's designed to care for 7,676. So we're effectively about a medium to large size prison short. That's the reality of where we're at. Now, it's only because we are able to work together and put in place appropriate measures and contingency plans that we are able to keep the service going. So as I say, this morning we unlocked 8,290 and we have achieved, in a sense, that extra capacity primarily through doubling up. So we have people doubled up in cells that otherwise we would only prefer to have one person living in. And we've, in a sense, leveraged some accommodation around the system that perhaps we would have preferred not to use. But I think it's important that the committee takes assurance that the SPS is not at breaking point, and I've already expressed that view to the Justice Committee. So members here that are both members of this committee and the Justice Committee will remember my evidence there. The prison service is not at breaking point. What I've been able to satisfy the Director General about is that there is further capacity in the system that we could leverage if we have to. And that capacity could take us up to a further 500 people to be contained within the Scottish Prison Service. Now, I wouldn't want to pretend at all to the committee that that would be a very pleasant experience for either the people who were sent to our care or for the people who are working in the system. But we could cater for another 500 people.
Where is that capacity, Mr McConnell?
That capacity would, as I've already explained, consist of further doubling up. So those cells that as yet only have one bed in them, then our clear intention is that we will effectively double every cell in the Scottish Prison Service to make sure that they've at least got 2 people in them. And then there are other facilities, such as Castle Huntly, the open estate, which is currently running with about 100 vacancies, but that's because of the risk management approach. Let's be clear, if the Scottish Prison Service comes under such pressure, then I will review with colleagues, I will review the mechanisms, the processes by which people are assessed as suitable for going there in order that we can maximise every single space in the system. Now that brings with it risks. That brings with it risks for the people that live there and for the people that work there. But if the population goes that high, we will have to take those risks.
Liam Kerr.
Thank you for that. Very briefly, Paul Johnson, do you have copies? You presumably forecasted. There's presumably some kind of scenario planning goes on. So do you have copies of those forecasts and the assumptions underpinning them for, let's say, the last 4 years since the legislation changed, for example?
We certainly have detailed information, and if it would assist the committee, we can provide the committee with information about our forecasting, both past and present, and the forecasting that's looking ahead.
It's really important to say that clearly the scenario that Colin mentions in terms of extra places is not Minister's preferred approach or our preferred approach. We are taking forward, have been taking forward a huge range of work to try and ease the pressures on the prison population. You're obviously all aware of the legislation on the presumption against short sentences that was approved by Parliament in June. You're also aware of the Management of Offenders Act that was passed also in June to try and extend the availability of electronic monitoring. We're putting additional resources into programmes including supervised bail, the Caledonian programme with reference to domestic abuse. We're looking again at the guidance around HDC to try and see if we can help ensure a safe release of prisoners. So there is a huge range of work going on to try and ease the pressures on the prison population. So that it's important that we are not just drifting on and expecting the numbers to carry on going up unless we take action.
Thank you. Willie Coffey.
Point that Mr McConnell raised there, the extra 600 you could accommodate by doubling up. What about Kilmarnock and Addiewell? Is it your preference to double up within the SPS prisons rather than to use Kilmarnock or Addiewell?
Yeah, I recall the previous evidence session in which both Addiewell and Kilmarnock were represented. So I'm sure the committee is aware that the contracts that we have with both of these facilities effectively cap the population in each of those the two locations. So for Addiewell, the maximum cap is an additional 96. And for Kilmarnock, the maximum cap is an additional 192. Now, we've already leveraged 96 of those places. So we have already advised the management team at Kilmarnock that we want access to those places. But what the committee will have to be aware of, and it's part of the planning and perhaps the reason why we're here, those spaces are extraordinarily expensive. So there is a set-up fee of just under £200,000, effectively just to have the application considered. And then there is a fee for each person that we send there on a daily basis. And whilst the committee might not want to go into detail, I can be very detailed in terms of how that would work out and what the associated costs of that will be. So it's, again, important the committee understands that we are not just trying to choke off, in a sense, the Scottish Prison Service, the public sector side of that. We are making sure that every opportunity to leverage a reasonable residential space is being maximised.
There's a set-up fee of £200,000.
I think actually it's about 178,000, something of that order.
To do what? Every time you use Kilmarnock, you have to pay a
No,
set-up
this is to access the final tranche of 96 places. So there is effectively a set-up fee, plus then there is a...
That's not a recurring, surely that's not a recurring...
No, that's a one-off set-up fee. Plus,
But
what is recurring...
We've been using Kilmarnock for years to get extra capacity. We must have paid it ages ago, surely.
As I say, there are different tranches, right. And this is some of the complexities of the contracts, but they are what they are. So we've already taken 96 places at Kilmarnock and 96 places at Addiewell. The remaining capacity at Kilmarnock has with it, if we want to access it, a set-up fee, which we have to pay up front. It's one-off, but it's quite a substantial set-up fee. Thereafter, we pay per capita for those spaces that we use.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Anas Sarwar.
Can I turn the committee to Exhibit 2, which focuses on sickness absence rates? Can you set out why the sickness absence rate is so high and explain why it's so much higher than England and Wales?
Yes, so our increase in sickness absence is entirely attributable to long-term sickness absence. We've actually seen a reduction in short-term absence over the same time period. So with long-term sickness absence, obviously the complexity of the conditions that we'd be looking at there has required further analysis over the last kind of 12 to 18 months. And we've done that in quite a lot of depth and looked at comparisons within England and Wales. We've seen stress be the kind of single biggest cause of that increase in absence, accounting for some 42% of that increase. And again, the complexities of that, whether that is work-related stress or stress unrelated to work, has required further analysis. So I think that in our monitoring of that, we've been able to identify those preventative measures that the SPS can be taking to support staff before they reach that point where it is work-related stress. And very much of that is to do with the complexities and challenges of working in a complex role and then in challenging circumstances of an overcrowded estate. We've been doing work on policy. Our policy does vary from the policy used by HMPPS, which has different trigger points in terms of managerial interventions for absence. So that's required some work with our trade union side. But yes, largely we've seen the increase in absence, long-term absence related to stress.
Yeah, I'll come back to the stress point in a second. You mentioned policy there. What's wrong with the current policy that's led to where we are today, and what changes are you proposing or implementing?
I think that the policy needs to be more proactive in its measures of support and well-being of staff, and how much we proactively support a culture of well-being working in prisons. The two don't necessarily go hand in hand, and I think that both the trade union side and the SPS would hope that we could be more proactive in our efforts in that regard. And as I say, the interventions, the trigger points, which would address in the process of case management, of managing absence, the trigger points could be slightly different, so we may intervene earlier and with different measures.
So in terms of the trigger points and intervening earlier, if you look at this, the second bar chart in Exhibit 2, over the course of 3 years, the number of days lost to stress-related sickness has more than doubled. That doesn't sound like we saw something bad was happening, we took the necessary action and we made improvements. That seems like we're failing, doesn't it?
I think when you're dealing with long-term absence, you're not going to see, when you see that rise in sickness absence for long-term absence related to conditions like stress, there is no quick fix in that. Often you're dealing with people, and we're seeing that in our attrition rate as well, that staff in our residential officer grades, where we're seeing the highest spike in our attrition, 40% of them are due to retirement, but 30% are due to people having to leave the service after a period of absence.
But what is so wrong with the working environment? It's clearly something's wrong with the working environment here, where you're having such high levels of sickness days and such high levels of stress-related sickness, and it doubling over a 3-year period. That something is clearly wrong with the working environment that you have set for your employees.
I think we recognise that, as I say, that the challenging circumstances of being a prison officer and working in the conditions of custodial environment can be incredibly challenging and complex. I don't think we necessarily correlate the rise in absence with the working conditions. I think that should be really clear. That's not the correlation. We're seeing a rise in stress, and some of that is not related to work. So
you see no correlation between the working environment and the rise in stress, or you see some correlation?
I would see some correlation.
Okay.
And I think that's apparent in the figure I've just quoted.
Correlation, I think that would be completely off if we thought there was no correlation between the working environment and stress.
Well, I certainly think, as I stressed in the beginning, that there is a balance of those absences that are stress that is related to work and stress that is unrelated to work. So I think I addressed that in my first point.
Okay. And in terms of the level of assaults that have taken place, they've risen significantly. So again, that's a working environment where there's a severe rise in assaults on prison officers. What do you put that down to? Is that purely the prison numbers, or is it the environment again, or is it around heavy drug use in some prisons? What do you think is the cause of the rise in assaults on staff?
I think overcrowding, certainly the cell sharing can create tensions where there might not ordinarily have existed. Yep. That's largely managed well by our staff, and I think when we look at the performance data for the SPS, what we should remember in this time frame where we have seen that increase, we've also seen significant change in the managing of the estate. For example, we've seen the smoking ban introduced. So actually to see the figures rise as moderately as they have in a period of such significant time when tension was greatly anticipated is a testament to the work that our staff have done to be able to manage that rising tension. So yes, I would suggest that overcrowding plays a part. Certainly where there are tensions, we see staff where they may have to intervene between prisoner and prisoner, and also assaults on staff. But yeah.
So going on Colin McConnell's suggestion about doubling up the rooms, you yourself said there that if by doubling up some of the rooms we've seen more difficult to manage, and that causing an increase in the number of assaults? And then
It can do.
I would guess there is a correlation between the number of assaults and the number of sickness days and the number of stress-related absences.
I don't have that data to hand, but yes, we do track where assaults then lead to periods of
Yeah.
absence. Then yes, that is tracked and monitored.
So you think there is a correlation?
I would have to check the data for that. I wouldn't say it's significant.
And so, going on Colin McConnell's suggestion about doubling up the remaining rooms, that sounds like we're suggesting that increasing the risk of more difficult prisons to manage, risking more assaults on staff, risking more sickness absences, and risking more long-term days lost to stress.
I think the cell sharing, actually, the evidence around cell sharing presents a range of both positive and negative factors for those, the impact of the custodial environment on those who are living in custody. I think that there's a risk of it, but the risk is a lot more generally connected to the overcrowding. So the limitation to access to services, for example, if we have more people in prison, then the time it takes to deliver the day-to-day services impacts individuals, and that in itself can cause tension. So again, I wouldn't necessarily relate it solely to the cell sharing. That's just one aspect of the overcrowding.
But as an aspect, you said it in an earlier answer, as an aspect. And so, final question, Convener, just on this is on the point that Colin McConnell made about doubling up the rooms and increasing capacity, what has the correlation been between increasing the number of staff in the prison estate with the rising number of prisoners and increasing, crucially, the support mechanisms available to staff in the prison estate around mental health support, around general medical support or other avenues of support that would be beneficial to them? Has there been a correlation between staff increase, prisoner number increase, and also support services increasing? And if not, isn't that a failure on your part?
So we have a corporate staffing complement, and it's designed by establishment, and it's designed to service a population of 7669, I believe. So we target our recruitment to be within 1% of that complement. We have no financial remit to recruit beyond that staffing complement, our pay budget.
That doesn't really answer the question.
You're asking if there's a correlation. Have we increased our staffing to adjust to the numbers?
Yeah, and the support services round about it.
The support services around it. I think that in each establishment, as has been alluded to by our colleagues, the monitoring that goes on attached to the risks, really, the operational risks of the overcrowding is reviewed on a weekly basis. And where we have within our remit to change staffing complements to address services, that might be through regime restriction in some cases. So redeploying residential officers who might be attached to vocational activities or work parties to more critical services. So we see some services restricted to be able to provide the person-centred one-to-one care that we need to. We can redeploy staff as needed, and we have seen an increase in that and monitor that closely. But in terms of increasing the staffing to accommodate the population numbers, no, that hasn't happened.
Okay, thank you.
Bill Bowman.
Good morning. Following on from the same issue, the Auditor General in Paras 2122 speaks about you having to ask officers to spend more time voluntarily to cover for sickness absence. And because they're not eligible for payments, you made ex gratia payments to them over a period of 3 years. And this has increased from just over 2 million to over 4 million. How do you run an organisation when you can't know that you can ask the staff to cover the job that needs to be done? And the second point the Auditor General made was that it seems that a number of these payments couldn't actually be verified back to the hours worked. The payments were made for hours that couldn't be determined or traced back to the time actually recorded.
Convener, I'll take Mr. Bowman's questions. I think it'd be good to get an understanding about the language first, so the explanation I think is helpful. I think we're as well just talking about overtime. We can call them ex gratia payments, whatever we like, but in this case, I think what the Auditor General was referring to was overtime. We don't have in SPS an overtime system per se. So actually, the mechanism, the methodology that we apply, the accounting procedure, comes under a heading of ex gratia payments. But in order just to be really clear, this is about paying the staff overtime. So if we go back to the discussion that we've had about the population and the pressures on the system, so we can provide evidence to the committee that prison officer recruitment has remained pretty static over the period. As Kate says, pretty much within about 1% or so of the funded staffing figure. So it shouldn't surprise the committee or anybody else that's listening to this evidence session that if the work demand goes up, we need more staff to do the work. But on the previous explanations that have been given, which I absolutely share and support, we took the view that because the population rises and falls over time, and it does. So, for example, when I took over the service in May 2012, there were over 8,400 people living in the Scottish prison system. In 2017, there were just over 7,300 living in the Scottish prison system. So that was a huge swing down, and now we've seen it swing back up. So the issue for us is at which point do you balance the system out? And the system is balanced out sort of midway, about, as I say, 77 to 7,800 or so. That's really what we're resourced for. So as it goes beyond that, we pay overtime to get staff to work more time until such time as we would expect that peak to drop off, and then the overtime would switch off and staff would go back to working normally. What has changed this time is that we are not yet experiencing that turnaround. And that's why I made the point earlier that we have to be careful and not mislead ourselves by imagining at the moment that this is a spike. It doesn't appear to be a spike, and it's going to perhaps stay at this level for some time to come. So if I may then just get on to the second bit of your...
No, can I just question on that?
Yeah.
But, I mean, you're saying then, I can understand the practicalities of that, but if that's not in the terms and conditions, you're still asking people, will you come in voluntarily to do this work? And that can't be an easy way to run an organisation.
I don't, if you like, I don't understand the premise or accept the premise that this is not within terms and conditions.
Well, it says in the report, prisoners' officers are not eligible for overtime payments, so you've been making significant voluntary, non-contractual payments to cover for the increased hours.
Again, I don't quite understand the premise that's been made in the sense that our staff are working additional hours. They work them voluntarily. Of course, we can't compel staff to work additional hours, but they work them voluntarily. And as you'll see from the figures they do so very willingly because there's a lot of hours being worked. So staff come and work voluntarily, successfully, and they get an overtime payment for it. And that's all recorded through our accounts. You raised the point about the DIP test. The 5 of the 10 that could not be reconciled. And as our auditors were effectively finalising our accounts for last year, we undertook to have our internal audit unit go and look at those 5 that couldn't be reconciled. And as we've already advised our external auditors, those 5 have already now been reconciled. So they have gone through the whole audit trail and have confirmed that those payments were absolutely appropriate and can be accounted for. And they've actually gone further, and they've done a much larger sample now. And whilst there has been some modest drift in a system that's coping with the volume that you've described, our internal audit are very clear that these are not material drifts and would be expected in a system of that capacity in terms of the volume it's dealing with.
So you've now cleared that with Audit Scotland?
With the confirmation has been given to our external auditors that has been reconciled. I would imagine our external auditors have advised Audit Scotland of that.
And was that by checking after the event and you found it was okay, or the person approving it knew at the time it was okay to approve?
Well, and again, that is the issue. So our independent auditors took 10 cases from thousands and found that 5, in the time that they had available to them, could not be reconciled. Now, our own internal audit have gone and looked at those cases and completely reconciled them.
Can I just go back on the first question, though, just to go back to this question of overtime? You don't have an agreement with them, the employees for overtime. You have, what, an informal arrangement that you make ex gratia payments, which may be quasi-overtime, but you don't have a structure within their contracts that speaks about overtime.
I take your point. If you know, in terms of the way that you're describing it, we do not have an overtime arrangement with our employees.
And is that something you're working towards and would desire?
Well, again, if I was sort of going with the logic of your question, then that is something that would be desirable. Actually, I don't think it's necessary, but I take the point, as I say, the logic that it would be something that if this is to continue in the longer term, then I think we could change the arrangements and describe it more appropriately as an overtime arrangement.
Okay.
Mr McConnell, forgive me, I'm not an accountant, but I don't understand that explanation. So, you talk about the independent auditors. Take it you're talking about Audit Scotland, who came in.
No, it's Scotland Creef.
Right, Scotland Creef came in on behalf of Audit Scotland.
Yeah, so each year our books are
You're
independently audited by Scotland Creef.
So they took 10 and they couldn't reconcile 5 of them. That's
Yes.
50%. And then your own internal audit function looked at the same 5 that couldn't be reconciled by Scotland Creef and did reconcile them.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, so why was Scotland Creef not able to reconcile them when your internal auditors were able to reconcile them?
I don't know.
So Scotland Creef not doing their job properly?
That's not for me to say. Scotland Creef reported, understandably, that of the 10 that they had audited, 5 could at that time not be reconciled. We agreed with Scotland Creef that our own internal audit would take those 5 and go back and look again. And
And it was all fine.
Sorry?
And it was all fine. All
Absolutely.
10 were fine.
Yeah, they've been reconciled. Yeah.
Alec Neil.
Supplementary to this. So once your internal auditor had said, yeah, we can reconcile those 5, does Scotland Creef, as the external auditor, then, if you like, give that the okay as being, legit?
We have a professional internal audit.
I know all
unit.
that, but my question is straightforward, yes or no. Does Scotland Creef come back in and say that the reconciliation done internally was legit?
Did they make a mistake?
No, but I think that needs context to it, Mr Neil.
What's the context?
So the context is that because we have a professional internal audit unit, there is assurance taken by our external auditors on work that they do. That work is periodically checked and externally validated. So I would fully expect that our external auditors would accept the view of our internal audit. And there's a full report being produced.
It's the professionalism of the external auditor I'm concerned about, why they couldn't reconcile it. And it seems to me, I mean, as a member of the audit committee, it seems to be highly unusual and so far inexplicable as to why one set of auditors couldn't reconcile it and another set, equally professional,
It's a matter of fact.
So I think we need to maybe probe the Auditor General on that one.
Absolutely. It's, I mean, the committee, it's a small sample, but I'm a strong believer that a sample of 9 or 10 is quite indicative. The fact that Scotland Creef are saying to us 50% of this can't be reconciled, but the prison service itself saying, no, actually, it's fine. It's a bit worrying for the committee, wouldn't you admit, Mr McConnell?
I'd come back, Convener, and if I may just reflect on your behaviours.
On our behaviours?
No, in terms of how that's being described. This is not a case of a wave of the hand to say this is fine. Our internal auditors have appropriately and diligently tracked the claims right through the process.
That's fine, Mr McConnell, but we've got to scrutinise the report that the Auditor General gave us.
Yeah, but I wouldn't,
and she quite clearly said that 50% of these ex gratia payments couldn't be reconciled?
In the time that our external auditors were working on this, there were 5 out of the 10 that they could not reconcile. Our internal auditors have professionally examined those 5 cases and have provided a written report with evidence to demonstrate that those payments were appropriate and can be approved.
And to go back to Mr Neil's question, have Scotland Creef been able to look at them since your internal auditors concluded that?
Scotland Creef is aware that they have been audited and cleared.
And do they agree with your conclusions?
We've not had that discussion, but I would doubt that they would disagree.
But surely you would want that. Surely if an external firm was to come in and say you're getting 50% of these wrong, this is a substantial financial risk to your organisation, surely you would want Scotland Creef to confirm that your workings are correct.
If it would at all service the committee to provide further assurance, I'm sure that could be arranged.
Okay, well, I think we need to explore this further with the Auditor General. Can I pick up one point on the ex gratia payments as well? Perhaps you have data that would substantiate this. It would seem to me that if your prison officers are under stress and you're seeing increasing numbers going off with stress, to ask them to do overtime might be a risk in exacerbating that stress rather than to bring in new officers to do the job, perhaps on a part-time basis. Has that been taken into consideration?
Part-time working hasn't been taken into consideration. And if you bear with me, I think we need to understand that it takes over a year to get a trained prison officer.
Sorry, if I can ask you to answer the first part of my question, have you considered that overtime could lead to increased stress?
Yeah, I think again, it would be silly of me not to recognise that in a pressurised environment, of which stress is a key element, inviting staff to spend more time in that environment itself would be stress-inducing. I think it's fair to say, though, that we don't really have a tremendous difficulty getting staff to work overtime.
And what does your data tell you? That surely you're looking at the data, you're carefully monitoring the staff who are doing overtime. Are they suddenly going off, or what's happening there? Kate,
do we have any data?
So our spend on ex gratia increased by 60% and our increase in absence is around 15%. So while both are rising, they're not rising at the same rate. So the pressures on the ex gratia system are coming from a range of deployment factors. So that could include people on restricted duties after a phased return to work who are not able to undertake full duties. It could cover vacancy shortfall or other restrictions on staff deployment. But do you know if the people going off sick are the people doing overtime? Surely you must know, because you know who's doing overtime, you know who's going off sick. You must be able to correlate the two. I don't have that data to hand. But I don't have that data to hand, but we could certainly look at that.
Okay, fine. Paul Johnson, you wanted to come in, and then going to move to Colin Beattie.
Yes, I think Colin has highlighted a very important issue around what should the normal staffing complement of the prison service be. And we have agreed that that is something that needs very careful consideration in the coming days. And there are 2 factors at play here. One is the numbers of staff and the use of ex gratia. The other is what is going to happen to the prison population. And we've heard about the factors at play which indicate that the prison population may remain high. Equally, what we've not yet had a chance to discuss in any detail is the range of work underway, much of it within Donna's area, designed to ensure that alternatives to custody are used more and more so that the numbers reduce. That gets into the analytical work which we've indicated we could share with the committee. We need to take a judgment on that in order to agree on what should the permanent staffing complement of the prison service be going forward.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Vera. I'd like to have a look at the Prison Officer Professionalisation Programme, which I'll refer to as POP, since there seems to be appropriate. There's nearly £14 million being paid to operational staff as part of this process. But at the end of it, there doesn't seem to be anything to show for this. What is the success criteria that was applied against this? And additionally, SPS paid a further £2.45 million to non-operational staff to settle equal pay claims, which apparently are related to this. How did that happen?
Mr. Beattie, Kate will deal with the first part of your question. I'll deal with the second.
So our programme for organisational reform is in keeping, it's evidence-based, first and foremost, and it's in keeping with the national ambition for public sector reform and very specifically aligned to criminal justice sector reform. So Scottish Government's own vision for workforce development calls for a highly skilled, qualified, compassionate workforce in its vision and priorities published in 2017. So we have had a range of enabling factors, if you like, to support that workforce development, and POP was a packaging of those elements specifically aimed at the frontline workers who, where there is an overwhelming body of evidence which suggests frontline staff and prison officers in particular have the greatest opportunity to influence and impact on the rehabilitative care of those who live in custody. So POP was very much a focused programme of operational reform. The payments that were made were to secure the continued engagement of the prison officer workforce during that time where we were at the table looking at what operational reform would look like. And I can't really stress enough how significant that was. Prison officers are a profession that haven't seen or been afforded the investment or attention that other caregiving professions have had over the last over a number of years. So actually the cultural challenges that we've been experiencing in the last maybe 4 to 5 years, I would say, are those that were encountered in, for example, the nursing profession decades ago. So the payments were to secure their continued engagement in that process and discussion around organisational reform. It's to our regret that at a ballot in October 2018, the offer, the reward and recognition that was attached to those proposals was rejected by members, but in no way does that indicate a suspension or indeed a ceasing of our progress in that journey.
You haven't described what the success criteria was. How do you measure value for money?
I think, well, first and foremost, I think that when I reflect on improvements in custodial care and the consistency and stability that we've seen in that in Scottish prisons over the last 4 or 5 years, I would say it was money well spent.
But when this was initiated, surely before you decide to spend £14 million, you decide what the success criteria is going to be. What are you going to achieve by it?
The success criteria was a package of co-produced enabling elements of organisational reform specifically targeted around prison officers, which include things like continuing professional development, revised entry standards, regulated practice. These standards were co-produced with the POA at the table, and indeed they were co-produced to the extent that it was a proposal that the POA put forward with the support of SPS management and Scottish Government to their members for ballot. So we very much reached the ambition that we would have co-produced a programme of operational reform that could be put to ballot.
I'm not really hearing anything very solid there in terms of, you know, the achievements, what you're going to get out of it.
So in terms of where we are, if you're asking where we are on the journey now?
No, I'm asking when you started off in this £14 million expenditure, you obviously decided that at the end of this programme you would have achieved certain goals.
Yes.
Those goals being certain levels of development of the prison officers and so on and so on. Were these all clearly laid out? Were they achieved?
So some, for example, were the development of first-line managers. That commenced in 2016 and continues today. The introduction of new e-learning environments for continued certification and self-directed learning were implemented this year. Revised entry standards, values-based recruitment, the introduction of a professional pathway for operational staff from 2020. These are all milestones that we've achieved.
You're telling me what's in the programme, not
no, I'm
what
telling
you
what's
actually achieved.
No, I'm telling you what's achieved. They're all things we've achieved.
Really?
Yes.
Just to take in the question then of the Prison Governors Association, they didn't support the payments and they were excluded from the discussions about the payments and the principles around them. Why was that?
So, as I've stressed, the evidence is overwhelming in regards of criminal justice reform and the unique opportunity that prison officers have. And it certainly was never our intention to single that out permanently, but it was the focus of our initial investment in professionalisation. So, it's important to draw a distinction between the Prison Governors Association, the representative union body, and the role of governors and managers in the development and design of this programme. the design of the programme was absolutely led and championed and engaged our senior management colleagues. The PGA then separately were engaged throughout the process, throughout 2016, 2017, 2018, on the progress of the programme. But it was not a programme that was targeted at the development. And actually the impact of the operational reform would have had very, very little impact on senior managers.
But we've had evidence from Nigel Ironside that the PGA was completely excluded.
No, that's not true. We have a catalogue of meetings that took place with the PGA
So you're
where
saying
this
the
was
evidence that
discussed.
we received and that was incorrect?
I think there's a difference between were they engaged, did they get the outcome that they wanted from that meeting, and that were we able to adjust the programme of operational reform to address their reward and recognition concerns? Then no, because that wasn't the aim of the programme. But were they engaged in the programme as it was designed, indeed designed and led by a number of governors, then yes, they were engaged in that process.
But they say they didn't support the payments. They were excluded from the discussion about the payments.
So, sorry, Mr. Beattie, I know that's what was said, but I think the evidence is to the contrary.
Do you have evidence to the contrary?
Yes, and we would be very content to share that with the committee.
I'm sure the committee would be interested in seeing that evidence.
Yeah.
Can I ask, just continuing on these payments, for the Scottish Government, given that I certainly remain sceptical as to the firmness of the success criteria, what considerations were taken into account when you decided to make these payments? Were you satisfied that adequate success criteria were in place, that there was proper goals and that these goals were achieved?
So the Scottish Government was involved in the development and evolution of the POP programme, and ministers did give their approval to the issuing of the particular payments that are in front of the committee today. And that was, as has been set out, on the basis that the payments were an important way of securing the continued engagement of the workforce in this transformation programme. So that was at the heart of the case, securing the continued engagement of the workforce, and that was accepted by ministers. However, I take very seriously what the Auditor General has said in paragraph 17 of her report, and I would wish to ensure that should these circumstances ever arise in future, either in this context or in another context, we're really clear about what is the shared expectation around success criteria in this sort of context, and that's something which I'm keen to have a further dialogue with Audit Scotland about.
That's fine going forward, but I'm concerned that we spent £14 million and I'm just not seeing or convinced that I'm seeing goals and achievements at the end of it that are commensurate with that expenditure.
I think it was fairly straightforward in terms of the success criteria at the time, which was the ongoing participation and engagement of the workforce in the development of the POP programme. That was secured, as we've heard. There was a positive environment for engagement with the workforce, though, as has also been said, it's a matter of significant regret that ultimately the full package was not supported by the workforce. I think it would be fair to say that that was not something that could have been readily anticipated given the positive engagement that took place. But nonetheless, it is, I think, important to recognise the aspects of that programme that have been capable of implementation, and indeed other aspects that are still being developed, some of which are now being developed in the environment of the new pay deal that has recently been agreed for prison officers.
I mean, everything I'm hearing says that there was no adequate goals put in place and there was no adequate assessment of achievement at the end of it. Tell me if I'm wrong, but that's what I'm hearing.
Convener, if I may, I think Mr. Beattie, I'm going to be straight and say I think you're wrong. I'll put this in context. The Scottish Prison Service and prison officering, if you want to look at it in that term, has remained pretty static, and I think this was part of the business case that's been missed here. It's been pretty static for 25, 30 years. You took evidence earlier from Phil Fairley, the chairman of the POA, and he's also chair of the TUS side in the SPS, who said that in 2013 prison officers were so disgruntled with their lot that they were about to ballot for strike action. That's the evidence that was given here. And in fact, when I started in May 2012, I literally got through the door and prison officers had just been on strike. So we need to put in context here the deep frustrations that our key workforce felt just a few years ago, and the fact that they were beginning to take industrial action to reinforce their case for change and for investment in the grade. I want to make sure the committee really understands the criticality of having the POA and prison officers working with us and not standing outside. It's a known fact that if prison officers in Scotland strike, within about 48 hours, the prison service is on its knees. That the criminal justice system itself.
We're all aware of the impacts of strikes in the public services. Mr. Beattie, do you feel you've had sufficient answer to your question?
I think I've had sufficient answer to that. I would like to find out about the 2.45 million for the non-operational staff, whether that was anticipated, budgeted, and was part of this programme.
Can you address that point, Mr.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. I mean, I'm disappointed that the time is not available to give you more context, but I'd be happy to engage with you separately about that.
As much context, just we were getting into the impact of strike there, and we're
quite
aware
on.
of.
Yeah,
okay.
I was just about to move on. But anyway, the focus on the additional payments that were made to non-prison officer staff. I think, as Kate has already set out for you, the focus of this change was on prison officers. And I would reiterate the point that prison officers have been clamouring for a modernisation programme for decades, and this was the opportunity to do it. Now, the original HR advice that we worked on was that the payments were to be made for prison officers because that was the sole group that was going to be affected by the changes that we were planning, that we were co-authoring with them. As time went on, we had a legal challenge to that position, which was that essentially, because of the way our job families were constructed, that people who were in equivalent grades were entitled to the payments. I think the reality was we had to make a decision of whether we followed through on the advice and defended that in court, I think which would have been costly and unseemly, or take the view, actually, that the fairest way to deal with this was simply to make the payments to those staff who were in related grades, and that's exactly what we did.
So this was unbudgeted and unanticipated at the time you started the programme?
Indeed, that's an accurate description of it.
Alec Neil.
Colin, you said earlier the system isn't broken, and I absolutely accept that compared to what's happening down south, and also the work that you and your staff are doing, you know, you're managing a very difficult situation. But when you look at the challenges, you know, as of yesterday, you're more or less 500 prisoners over capacity, possibility of another 500. You're having to put people in double cells, which, as Neil said earlier, is not the Scottish Government's intended policy for all the other reasons we've heard about contributing to assaults and all the rest of it. What I'm not hearing, either from the government or from yourself, is the way forward. I mean, your revenue budget is down 12.5% in real terms, while your population, prison population, is rising exponentially and could possibly rise even more exponentially, as you say, in the months and years ahead. So where do we go from here? I mean, it seems to me, you know, the capital programme, Berlin, Inverness, Greenock, all behind schedule. And it's very clear from the overcrowding that these capital programmes are absolutely essential to medium-term solutions to the problem. Where is the plan to avoid the system breaking down?
Well, I can certainly start off. I think it's very important that we do look at the way forward. And a key aspect of the way forward is the much greater use of community alternatives, which we know are more effective for many than prison sentences. And I would like to hand over to my colleague Donna just to give a very brief picture to the committee of the intensive work that is being done to increase significantly the use of community alternatives and ultimately reduce the prison population, if the committee would find that helpful.
Can I say, with all due respect to Donna, we've actually had a lot of that. We're aware of a lot of that. That's not my question, Paul. My question is, even with this drive to community sentencing, the prison population is rising exponentially. We are putting people in double cells, which is going back the way, not forward. We're behind substantially in the capital programme, and the revenue budget is 12.5% in real terms down. I want to hear, when are you going to solve the crisis in terms of the accommodating the prisoners you're likely to have in the next 5 years?
So there are a lot of different dimensions to that. I'm very happy to deal with each and every dimension of it. In terms of the budget this year, we are making available additional resources to the Scottish Prison Service.
How much?
We have made available up to £24 million.
And what does that do to the 12.5% figure?
That would, it may be that Neil would have the exact figures to hand, but that would mean that ultimately this year, overall, if that 24 million is drawn down, we would be looking at an overall increase in the budget for 1920, and that's on the basis of the court.
There's been a 12.5% decrease in the last few years per the Auditor General's report. So with the additional 24 million, instead of that being a 12.5% real decrease, is that 10? Does it make it a 10% decrease, an 8% decrease? What does it do?
I don't have the percentage figure in front of me, but Neil may have more.
That wasn't the way in which it was. That wasn't the way in which it was calculated. Clearly, it's a real terms increase in terms of.
Well, what's the total budget? What's 24 as a percentage of the total budget?
It's about 8%. So I'll double check that.
So does
I can
that
give you
reduce
the
it really
exact
to
figure.
4.5%? And is that money guaranteed for next year and the year after? Because you can't expect the prison service to achieve the policy objectives you've laid out quite rightly, if you don't fund it.
Yeah, absolutely. And as Paul said in his opening statement, we recognise that part of the solution to this is investment. We've provided additional money in the current year to assist with the pressures that Colin identified for us and to support those, including additional prison places, including additional investment. We've also said that we're willing to look at other opportunities for investment, for example, in the medium term in Barlinnie until a new prison can be constructed. So absolutely, we recognise part of this is about ensuring that Colin is supported with additional resources. We can talk separately about the estate's position, but certainly it's not the case that the Scottish Government has not provided capital funding for the prison's estate, either over the long term or more recently.
So just to clarify, Neil, the 24 million is all revenue funding?
Yes.
Right. So what's going to happen with the capital funding? I mean, I see you've identified a site for the new Barlinnie. When do you expect the new Barlinnie, the new Inverness and the new Greenock to be built?
I'll allow Colin to come in on the details in terms of timing, but certainly for this year we've provided an element of funding to the prison service for the provisional work in terms of Barlinnie, again as identified by the SPS of what their costs were for the current year, and we're engaging closely with Colin in terms of what the future costs of a replacement for HMP Barlinnie, and that is absolutely in our infrastructure investment plans going forward. There's substantial money in the current year for the female estate, but that's obviously dependent on the tendering process for...
I mean, it's behind schedule as well, isn't it? I mean, when are we going to get the new Barlinnie? Can somebody answer the question? When are we going to get the new Barlinnie?
If you don't mind me addressing you directly, Alec, as soon as possible, but likely 24-25,
right,
assuming everything works well. If you don't mind, I'll comment on the women's strategy, because there is some learning here. And those who sit on the Justice Committee will recall my evidence in terms of why Barlinnie has taken so long. And I can say to the committee that NIMBYism is pretty much alive and well. Nobody really wants a prison in their backyard. It's taken way too long, but it's taken a long time to identify a site which someone was prepared to sell us. and we thought was suitable to buy. And as you know, that's pretty much on the other side of the road from where Berlini is currently located. The site itself is likely to require considerable remedial works. It's the old gasworks site, so there'll be clear up all the rest of it, and then proper engineering considerations about what that means for the overall build programme. But we're estimating 24-25, but there's a cautionary note with this, if I may, and that's in relation to what you said about the women's programme. I mean, that slipped by a year and may yet slip a bit further. We're as frustrated with that as anyone could be, but it's where the market's at. And not to, I don't know how much I can give away in a public space, but you know, we have really struggled to get compliant bidders to come forward for the scope and scale of the works. That's twice effectively had to be reset to go back to the marketplace. The potential contractors tell us that Brexit has an impact on that in terms of concerns about workforce and so on and so forth. So all of that taken into account.
Clarification on that. You said the contractors are worried about the scale of the works, but the women's estate is moving to much smaller units. I mean, a site has been approved in Dundee. It wouldn't strike me that the scale of what is. I've seen the plans for the unit in Dundee. It's not large.
I perhaps used an inappropriate term, the value, the commercial value.
They're saying you're not giving them enough money.
I think that's well, no, it's not that we'd want to give them as little as possible, of course, but yes, it's the overall value to the market to get contractors of an appropriate size to come forward. That's been a real challenge for us. At the end of the day, we only got 2 to come forward, both of which, just within the last few months, have asked for a pause and asked for more time to consider their offer, which we agreed. And in both those cases, both have come back with inflated costs and extended timescales. That's, if I may say so, that's the reality of the marketplace we're in. And I use that as a cautionary tale in terms of we really, really would like Berlini by 24-25, and I think that's doable. But ultimately, you know, we're at the whim of the market to deliver us something in that time scale.
Just on that, quite often we see in the public sector that we package up all these capital projects to make them so large in scale that it limits who can bid for them. Have we considered dividing it up and making it so it's multiple contractors doing different parts?
It's actually the other way around, Mr. Sarwar, in the sense that it's not about breaking them up. It's about making them valuable enough in a sense of their commercial value for the big companies to come forward and do it. So, for example, if I may go back to Alec Neil's challenge, which we would welcome, which is, you know, where is Berlini, where is Highland, where is Greenock 2? I suppose if I was sitting on the other side of the fence, if I was sitting in the world of a construction company, then, you know, if potentially, and I don't know if there's any company could take a contract like that, but if there was something which was of such scope and scale that brought more players into the market, then I think we'd be in a potentially better position.
We could pursue this quite in a lot of detail, but given the limited time we have, and I think it is something we'll need to look at as a committee, clearly these new facilities are not going to come on board anytime soon. And we're talking about a 4 or 5 year gap at least before we get the new Berlini, not to mention the other facilities. So that's during that period. Let us assume the worst, because I think the worst is happening in terms of the exponential rise meantime. Now you get to a stage where, as you say, you could probably accommodate another 500 prisoners if pushed to do so by doubling up. But, you know, that's completely the reverse in terms of what we're trying to achieve in the criminal justice system. Now, therefore, do we not need to look at other things? For example, as you know, I have serious concerns about the self-change programme, which, if it was working properly, one of the benefits of that would be potentially to reduce the prison population, not by large numbers in any one year, but nevertheless make a contribution. Similarly, you know, I'm told the oldest prisoner in the prison system in Scotland is 99. Do we really need to be locking people up in prison at the age of 99? And obviously the age profile of prisoners, particularly with these dated sex cases going back a while, I'm told is adding to the age profile, which is putting pressure on in terms of social care requirements, health requirements and all the rest of it. And we know a very high percentage of people are in prison as a result of their mental health problems, more as much as anything. You know, should we not be looking at more imaginative solutions, doing something really urgent on the self-change programme, which I think is just in deep, you know, it's not working the way it should be. It should not be some of the people with mental health problems, would they not be better in secure mental health units? 99-year-olds, surely to goodness, we can get better accommodation for a 99-year-old.
Mr McConnell.
Thanks, Convener. I think some of these issues will undoubtedly be for policy colleagues. But I think responding just directly, Mr Neil, to your multifaceted challenge, I agree with everything you said. You know, there are too many people in our prisons, but that's the reality of where we are, and we have to try our best to care for them. The more...
you know, I'm sorry to interrupt, but is it not the case that a more imaginative approach, and you would require obviously the government to be involved in this, in terms of do all the people in prison, particularly the older ones, particularly people with severe mental health problems, is that the best place for them to be? Should we not be looking imaginatively, not just because of the overcrowding in prisons, but for their own benefit, for their rehabilitation? You know, if more money went into the self-change programme, if some people who would more appropriately be housed in secure units, at least one of the benefits would be it would relieve the pressure. The main benefit is it's the right thing for them.
Okay, Mr McConnell.
I just wonder, actually, if that's more appropriate for policy colleagues to address.
Well, I heartily agree that we need to look at all possible options for addressing this situation. That is why even today we have a Community Justice Leadership Group meeting that my colleague Donna will be heading to right after this, chaired by the Scottish Government and COSLA, to look at what we can do to improve the availability of options out in the community, both prior to conviction in terms of alternatives to remand and as alternatives to a custodial sentence. I absolutely agree that there is a real urgency to that work, and I see that it is being taken forward and it needs to deliver more.
That and in years gone by, you know, Kenny McCaskill drove a lot of this stuff, as you know, which, you know, had the impact of reducing the prison population. It seems to me the energy in the last few years has gone out of this. We need some more energy and some more action. We keep hearing about all these groups that meet, but what are they doing? It's time we get action.
Can I give you just a couple of statistics just to help with that? And the convener mentioned at the beginning that 10-year horizon and what has happened over the 10 years. 11 years ago, Scotland's Choice, the report of the Prisons Commission was published. And what it identified was the key driver, the key pressure on the prison population at that time was short-term offenders, the growth in the number of people coming into prison for very short periods of time and churning through the prison system. Over the last 10 years, that has been transformed. There are 5,000 fewer people went into prison in 17-18 compared to the decade before. There's been an increase in the proportions of people who are receiving community sentences rather than community sentences as a proportion of all those convicted. So we have made substantial progress in the areas you would want.
I'm not denying that. I'm just saying
other factors are feeding into the pressures.
The foot has to go back on the accelerator.
Absolutely.
Big style.
But all I would say is, I hope we have not taken the foot off the accelerator. It's clear, and I was really interested in reading the recent research by the University of Cardiff, looking across the world at what helps reduce prison populations. And what they said is, It is a multi-phase, long-term approach that we need to keep moving, that single solutions will not solve it. It requires long-term commitment in a political level, it requires long-term commitment from government, and it requires the engagement of wider agencies across the whole system, exactly as you say, across health, across housing, across social security, and that is the approach that we are trying to drive forward and is reflected in the work that we have.
Thank you, Mr Rennick. Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener. I was going to ask some questions on the capital underspend and the delays in the estate, but they've been pretty much covered by Alec Neil. So instead, I'll ask a question about Kilmarnock Prison. As you know, I'm the member for Kilmarnock and Irvine Valley, and for a number of years, representatives have been asking about the contract. It's a 20-year contract that's been in place now, as I understand, with Bowhouse. Has it ever been reviewed or changed in that period?
Didn't hear the question, Mr Coffey, sorry.
The contract with Kilmarnock Prison, which is 20 years old, has it ever been reviewed or changed in any way, shape or form during the 20 years?
To my knowledge, there's never been over that period a fundamental review. But that's fairly typical, I think, of the contracts that exist for prisons, not just here, but I think more generally. There are ongoing discussions. We have a contract monitoring and management team, and both sides essentially to that contract can seek to vary elements of it, not substantially the contract, but vary particular elements of it. And I am aware that for both of the contracts, both Addiewell and Kilmarnock, there have been variations over time, but substantially the contracts have remained the same.
How do we know that they're fit for purpose and delivering value for money and service if we haven't really looked at the operational contract over such a period?
If I may say so, I think that is one of the downsides of 25-year contracts, which of course are signed on a commercial basis. So at the outset, I assume that the person offering the contract thinks that over this period they're going to get a good deal, and the person who's offering the service, or the company that's offering the service, thinks likewise. So there's a mutuality to it. In terms of how do we measure whether the contracts are value for money, I think that assumption is probably made at the time the contract is signed over the period, but there is constant monitoring in terms of the delivery requirements that are set out in the contract for both Addiewell and Kilmarnock. Then, of course, the Chief Inspector has a role, and as you know, the inspection regime is that about every 3 years or so, a prison is substantially inspected against not only the national inspection standards, but commentary is made on the delivery of services.
Can I give you a couple of examples that have been given to me over the years, particularly by Stevie Farrell, who gave evidence in the round table? He said this, that he took the opportunity to raise this perverse system of operating that sees the contractors charged or fined for successfully finding things like contraband or mobile phones and so on and so forth, charging for the successful recovery of these things, which result in the prisons becoming safer, seems to discourage rather than encourage the private prisons from being proactive in their approach. What do you say to that?
That's an interesting presentation, actually, because the reality is, as with all prisons, the challenge is to keep things out. And for the contracts, there is a point in the prison up to which we would expect the service provider to detect and find things. So in terms of those contracts, they are fined, if you like, they accrue service credits when something gets beyond effectively the inner seal of the prison, the security seal of the prison. So the fines or the service credits are only applied when the stuff gets beyond that and effectively into the prison. So I think we've got to be really clear about this, that the contracts are established in a way that sets a boundary at which the contractor is expected to detect things and keep it out. It's only if it goes beyond that that a service credit is leveraged. So I understand how it can be presented as a perverse incentive, but actually the incentive is to keep the stuff out.
Okay, where does the the fine money go? Where does it go? How much? Could you
yeah.
tell us how much you've recouped from, say, Kilmarnock in a given year?
Indeed.
in
If you
fines?
don't mind, I'll ask my
Where does the money go?
financial colleague to deal with that. Mel, would you pick that up, please?
So over the past 3 years, service credits in relation to Kilmarnock have been £500,000, and that money, like any other service credits for non-performance, is offset against the expenditure in the year for the against the contract.
So that kind of level of money, it's another point that's been made over the years. Would that money not be better reinvested in purposeful activity, for example, for the prisoners, rather than being pulled out of the system? Because they raised a lot of issues about that too, that they could, instead of fining them for doing things well, could that not be reinvested in the prison population and services and so on within the estate, particularly like Kilmarnock and Addiewell? Is that not part of the...
Again, it's
not a good idea.
It's a reasonable proposition, but of course the thing to keep in mind is that you know, the contracts are in themselves a specification of what services have to be delivered, and those specifications are quite tight. So it's only when the service delivery is not being made or sustained that a service credit is leveraged. It would seem a bit odd to then reinvest in something that's not delivering. And if I may just sort of cycle back to a bit of evidence that was presented previously, which I think, given the line of questioning that you're pursuing, Mr. Coffey, perhaps gave the impression on a regime delivery perspective that somehow the private sector prisons were way outperforming the public sector prisons. They are not. And in fact, it's a bit of a startling figure, but 60% of the regime hours that have been lost in total across the Scottish prison service, 60% comes from the 2 private sector prisons. 60% out of 2, 40% out of 13. So if I can go back to the understandable challenge that you're making, why would we effectively take a service credit from somebody who's not delivering and then give them back to essentially deliver more that potentially won't be delivered? I think that's actually a perverse incentive.
Okay. I understand the contract is up for renewal in 5 years, I think. What's the thinking about...
For Kilmarnock, there's about 5 years to go. For Addiewell, it runs through to 2033. I think. So it's a long way to go for Addiewell.
But for Kilmarnock, it's 5 years. Are we well prepared in thinking about the future there and what it might look like? And might you look at the contract and some of the aspects that I've mentioned to you to see if mutual benefit can be derived in the system? So the direction of travel is, and the Cabinet Secretary, I understand, has reinforced this position, is that at the cessation of the contract period, they will revert to the public sector. So I know it's 5 years out, but that's already on our radar. There's a lot of experience from moving from contractor to contractor in England and Wales, which we learn from. But we are already beginning to look ahead, assuming that political position doesn't change, to probably about 2 years out or so, working intensively with the contractor and SG colleagues to make sure that transition is as smooth as possible. So Kilmarnock will be coming back into public?
It will be coming back into the public sector.
Okay, thank you.
Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Convener. Just a few short clarifications on particularly Willie Coffey's line of questioning there. Colin, just right at the end, you said Kilmarnock would come back into the public sector. Who owns the actual asset at the moment, do you know?
We've got a technical expert here, but as I understand it, the asset, the whole asset reverts to the public sector at the end. That's actually written into the contract. Right. So potentially, I appreciate him coming at it without the information, but potentially was no cost into the public sector. Understand. Are you able, just going back to actually Willie Coffey's line earlier on, are either of you able, either Colin McConnell or Paul Johnson, able to provide us with a comparator cost of the cost of a prisoner between an SPS prison and, let's say, Kilmarnock, just so I can actually compare like with like in terms of the cost of accommodating a prisoner? And really where I'm going here is, presumably there's a cost written into
the private prisons cost of prisoner, which covers the building of the asset in the first place? I may be wrong, but are you able to provide that comparison for me?
Mel?
So SPS, as part of the KPIs, published the cost per prisoner place, which is based on the design capacity. And for 18-19, that was £35,601. But that is based on the design capacity, the service, not actual numbers. A comparison for Adderall and Kilmarnock can only be, we can only calculate that based on what the contract costs us during the year and based on the number of places that we've called off. So it's not a true cost per prisoner place. We don't have Adderall and Kilmarnock's running costs. So there is caveats with that calculation, but a very rough calculation on that Adderall, a cost per prisoner would be 47,500 and Kilmarnock approximately 27,000.
Thank you. Just sticking with the private places, but going back to a more general question, were the private places called down in previous years? So at the moment, I think what I'm picking up is that there is a bit of extra capacity in the 2 private prisons, and that's being kind of called down upon. Has that happened in previous years, or is this year a spike on that? And in any event, was that not budgeted for at some point in previous years?
Yeah, indeed. So when I arrived in 2012, all of the extra places, I understand it, in both of the prisons were active. So SPS was actually paying out for the total spaces. As the population dropped off, as I've already explained to the committee, those places were decommissioned, and effectively those resources have gone back to the Scottish Government over time.
Right. Thank you.
I want to come back to this point about capital underspend, because we've got the situation today where Barlin is 50% over capacity, we need a new prison, there's talk of replacement for Greenock. I'm really concerned about the women's estate. We had human rights experts go into Cornton Vale just a month ago, and the conditions there, I mean, I've been to Cornton Vale, conditions are horrendous, and it has been accepted in this Parliament for a number of years now that we need to move to the custodial units. I'm still not clear, Mr McConnell, on your answer to the question and your explanation of the tendering process. I mean, I know you're a lot closer to it than, you know, my knowledge of it, but can you either bundle up or debundle to actually, I'm sure there are contractors out there who are willing to build these facilities. So I'd like a clearer answer to that, if you don't mind. But also, I'm really concerned about the capital underspend because it's year on year. And it's not just the tendering process, is it? Because we've been told that the reason in 2018-19 was the slippage in the capital programme, including the women's estate. In 17-18, the reason you handed back your capital money to Paul Johnson was the underspend delays in repairs and maintenance programmes. That's nothing to do, I don't think, with tendering process for new buildings. In 16-17, the reason you handed the money back to Paul Johnson was the slippage in Cornton Vale, and again the women's strategy. In 15-16, it was the ministerial decision not to proceed with female prison in Inverclyde. In 14-15, it was a delay in acquiring a suitable site for HMP Highland. So year after year, the Scottish Government is giving you money to build new prison facilities, and partly it looks like a fault of ministers, but partly also your maintenance programme, your tendering process. Why can't you get this stuff right? Why do you keep handing money back to the Scottish Government and we've got facilities that are failing?
An absolutely fair challenge, Convener. I'll ask Mel to pick up the detail of that. But if I may say, in terms of your concerns about Cornton Vale, which I share, we are at the position now where we do have a preferred contractor, so all of those difficulties have been worked through, and they have been torturous, I have to say.
So have you got a contractor now for these custodial units?
Indeed.
You do?
So we have a preferred contractor, and that's why we're able to say that we anticipate the completion of the strategy or the building side by 2021. That's our current position.
Okay,
But,
so that
if-
money will be spent?
Yes.
Okay, well, that is good news for the women's estate.
I'm sorry if I wasn't clear about that earlier. I perhaps took a bit too long in explaining some of the difficulties that we encounter.
Is it the same contractor that's going to build the unit in Dundee and in Glasgow?
I can't comment on that.
Right, okay. What, is it commercially sensitive?
I'm not
Or do you
au
not
fait
know?
with just
You don't know?
who it
Okay.
is. Yeah. Could I ask Mel to respond to the capital concerns that you have, generally?
Yes.
Yeah, just as you pointed out, we have capital underspends that we've reported for the past 5 years. Cumulatively, they come to around 42 million. 35 million of that was in relation to the women's estate in 15-16, where it was announced that the Inverclyde would no longer be a women's facility. So that was a change in direction for the women's facility. That 35 million was not redeployed by the centre Scottish Government, so that showed as an underspend in our books for that year. That's the most significant underspend that we've had in capital. And I think the other point probably to note is when we're funded on an annual basis, it's very difficult to commit to longer term projects, specifically infrastructure, where we need a 5-year commitment and funding to move forward.
Paul Johnson, why do you keep giving the Scottish Prison Service capital money when it's partly ministerial decisions that prevent them from spending it? And then you take it back at the end of the year.
Well, this is a matter which we work on very closely with SPS colleagues, and I think, as Colin has set out, a number of factors have caused slippage and delay. What I would like to emphasise is we want the women's estate in particular to be built without further delay. We want to get on with the construction of the replacement to Barlinnie, and we are working very closely with the Scottish Prison Service on what the multi-year capital requirements for that will be. As the committee will appreciate, we do set budgets on a year-by-year basis, and Scottish Prison Service, as an executive agency, in common with all other agencies, have those budgets fixed year to year. That does not get away from the need to do intensive multi-year planning. That has been happening, and that will absolutely continue, because we want to get these establishments constructed as quickly as possible.
Because we heard evidence in an earlier session, which I'm sure you've read, that some of our witnesses thought that actually the money that was never intended to be spent, and it was always intended to be handed back.
It is absolutely not the case that we pass capital money in the budget, which is approved by Parliament, to the prison service with the intention that it would be handed back. That is not the case.
Mr Johnson.
It's really important to say that there isn't any advantage for us in that, because that capital needs to be spent on the women's estate, and we're going to have to find it in future years. If money isn't spent this year, we need to find it in future years. So it just adds to the pressures. It doesn't provide any benefit for us, that capital not being spent.
Okay, final point on this. Mr Johnson, would you accept that for the public watching this, people visiting Barlinnie and familiar with Barlinnie will know that it is not a facility that is up to scratch? People know that Cornton Vale needs to desperately be closed and replaced by more modern facilities for the very vulnerable female prisoners that are in it. And then they see the Scottish Prison Service handing back the money for these buildings to you every year. Do you accept that that seems unacceptable to the public?
I can see why the pattern that you have set out causes...
Well, it's the Auditor General that set it out, not
yes,
me.
I absolutely accept it. I can see why it causes concern, and it's why I am absolutely determined that we will work closely together to ensure that the women's estate is completed as quickly as possible, and at the same time work on Barlinnie is completed. And it's one issue which is currently subject to discussion with SPS to ensure that we have the right level of capability and expertise, drawing on whatever expertise may be available from across public services to ensure that the urgent requirements that exist for these buildings are met.
Okay, forgive me, but the Auditor General says, page 13 of her report, in reference to HMP Barlinnie and HMP Inverness, there is no funding available to replace these two prisons.
Well, if you look at a year-by-year basis, you do not see in an annual budget the capital funding required for Barlinnie. But I would have to take some issue with that comment, because what I can confirm is ministers have recognised the need for the construction of Barlinnie, and therefore confirmed that we will be making resources available in future years for that capital investment.
So you're going to make more money available. Neil Rennick?
Okay, just to confirm that there is money available for the cost of Barlinnie in the budget for this year, but that sum is very small because that's just for the preliminary work. We all recognise that it's going to be a significant capital cost, but that cost will come further down the line because we've obviously only got a site this year identified.
Okay. Well, we're about to hear from the Auditor General after you leave, and she'll give us our views on that. But if there are any points we want to pursue further with you, we will write to you seeking further clarification. Final point, Mr McConnell, can you guarantee me that the women's units in Dundee and in Glasgow will be open by when?
2021. A guarantee? My goodness, convener.
It's been. I mean, is it 10 years now since the Angelini report? This has been an ongoing. So.
Yes, it has. And as I've said to the committee already, I can assure you, as custodians of the system, we want those facilities as soon as we can get them. I can give you my absolute personal assurance that SBS will do everything it can to get those facilities up and running by 2021.
Okay, thank you. Do members have any further questions for our witnesses? Colin Beattie and then Anas Sarwar.
Just one quick one. Given the difficult circumstances that the prison service is in, and given the need for strong leadership, obviously during this period, who thought it was a good idea to send 2 of the 3 executive directors on secondment and put interim bodies in place?
And it's working well. Let's be clear. We have opportunities and necessities to make sure that our senior people are well developed and well rounded, so that they add value not just to the SBS but to the civil service cadre in general. And that's part of effectively the civil service guidance in terms of workforce development. What that has allowed us to do, Mr Beattie, is to pull through colleagues who have quite a different background, and you've got one of them sitting here today. So these are colleagues who bring other skills and knowledge and experience to how the service runs. And I can tell you, as Chief Executive Officer, that I have 2 colleagues out who are getting fantastic development experience in other areas of public service, and I've got 2 colleagues who have replaced them, who are adding different skills and different approaches and making just as an effective impact on the business.
So these secondments are still within the civil service?
One is within the civil service and the other is to an NDPB, I think, the Scottish Canals.
How long are they for?
One is for 5 years and one is for 2 years.
5 years seems an extraordinary length.
It's a CEO role, so I think there's about having impact in the business as well. It's not just a case of go out and come back in. I think we've got to be reasonable with the business in which that person is going into in order that they get return from it. What I would say, though, is again, thinking where I started from, these are people who are going to be of enhanced value to public service in general when those opportunities come to an end.
But filling in an interim basis, a very senior post for 5 years, I mean, is that person ever going to come back to that post?
Well, I think that's a good point to raise, and in fact, they may not. They may go to other areas of public service, but I think in that is the added value. They don't necessarily have to come back to prison service. We've got fantastic opportunities then to bring people through, as I say, with different skill mixes, different experience, a different offer, but actually make sure that the business is remaining vibrant and capable of meeting the challenges. And in my view, it is.
Thank you. Anas Sarwar.
I just wanted to go back to the point about Barlinnie and know that you said hope it opens in 2024 or 25. From the evidence that we heard previously, the conditions in the existing Barlinnie are so severe. in terms of the outstanding maintenance work that's required. We already know how overcrowded the general estate is, but in particular Berliniads as well. Is the remedial work that needs to be done for it to continue to exist being done? Because if we end up having a tragic incident at the Berlini, which requires either part of it or all of it to shut, we're in a really, really dangerous situation. So what contingency work or planning is done for that situation, and what remedial work is happening to make sure it continues to function as best it can until the new Berlini is open?
So, over the last 10 years on Berlini alone, 30 million has been invested in keeping the prison in a sort of viable operational state. And we continue to do that this year. There is significant investment in Berlini. So, you know, if I can go back...
What level of investment?
Sorry?
What level? You said significant.
Do we have that
What
detail
level?
here, Mel?
£1.2 million.
So there's a further 1.2 million being spent this year. And we will continue to do that with the support of government, Scottish Government colleagues. We will continue the investment in Berlini through to the point at which we move to the new working title at HMP Glasgow. In terms of, sorry, can you just remind me of the second part of your question? It was in two parts.
So what contingency measures in place if we do have a crisis situation in Berlin that means either part of it or all of it has to?
So I mean, so Berlini, it's as you'll know, I mean, it's a big site, and part of the contingency planning that we've been doing is on the basis that it's a prison that's been functioning from, I think, 1853, something like that. So it's been in constant use. So we're always live to the possibility that something at Berlini could go wrong. And in fact, I think it's probably about 2 months ago now, we had a complete failure of the water supply system in one of the wings. So that was for about 400 people, say. Now, that was a fairly major failure at Berlini. But our contingency plans kicked in. We were able to bring water tankers in. Water was piped up into the tanks, and that kept going until such time as the valve work that had failed was fixed. So we have contingencies around water, electricity, heating, so on and so forth. But probably to go to, I think, with the nub of your challenge, it might be what if there is a significant infrastructure failure that requires us perhaps to decant some of the accommodation. And I think that goes back to where I was earlier. And we have to be really realistic about this, that we would move the pressure elsewhere in the system. So taking that example, where if...
I think it's an important question, so I've allowed Mr McConnell to answer it, but we are running short of time, and it was quite a detailed question for the end of the session. If there is more information, Mr McConnell, on that, can you write to us,
Of course, yes.
With the... Alex Neil, quick question,
I'll
please.
be very briefly, just to ask for a comprehensive, up-to-date briefing on the self-change programme in terms of the throughput of numbers graduating, the waiting list, you know, the challenges facing the programme. I think that would be extremely helpful because...
Can you write to us with that as well, Mr McConnell? That would be very helpful. Okay, can I thank you all very much indeed for your evidence this morning. I'm going to suspend until 10:55 for a comfort break. Thank you. And close the public session.